They say music has the power to heal, to connect, to tell the stories we can't put into words. But what happens when the music you've created, your very soul poured into melody, is taken from you? What happens when the person you trust the most is the one who hands it away? This is the story of Ndwele, a woman whose voice could move mountains, and Zuberi, a man who loved her but made a choice that shattered everything. A love story woven in music, broken by betrayal and rebuilt through redemption. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about love, it's a story about trust, about loss, about finding the strength to forgive, even when it feels impossible. Before we dive in, if you love stories that stir the soul, that make you feel every emotion deep in your chest, hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this, they're meant to be shared. In the heart of a city that never truly sleeps, where neon lights flicker against the pulse of Afrobeat rhythms, there lived a woman whose soul was made of melodies. Ndwele, her hands, a vessel for music, her voice, a whisper between the strings of fate. And then there was Zuberi, an architect with a mind for blueprints, but a heart that beat for music. Their worlds collided in a place where creativity had no walls, her small home studio, tucked away in the city's hidden rhythm, a place of sounds, of dreams, of possibility. It began with a song, a late-night session, keys under fingertips, a soft melody filling the space between them. Zuberi sat close, watching, listening, drawn in, as if the music were a tide pulling him deeper. He tapped his fingers to the beat, hummed softly. Ndwele glanced up, the corners of her lips curving in amusement. "Stay in your lane, architect," she teased. "Music has no lanes," he replied, and so they worked. Two souls bound by a language deeper than words. With every note, they built something unspoken. In the hush between chords, they found the rhythm of something neither had dared name. Love, like music, is composed in the silences. Days turned into weeks, and with every song they created, the bond between them deepened, weaving itself into the very fabric of their existence. The nights grew longer, not because they had to, but because neither of them wanted to leave. Even when exhaustion whispered its warning, even when the city outside slowed into slumber, they remained. Ndwele at the piano, Zuberi beside her, their laughter spilling into the quiet. Some nights, they worked with a feverish intensity, perfecting harmonies, layering beats, deconstructing and reconstructing sounds until something felt just right. Other nights, they barely worked at all, letting conversation fill the spaces where music usually lived. She would play a few notes experimentally, then pause, tilting her head. "Too much?" she'd ask, a hint of doubt creeping into her voice. Zuberi, eyes half-lidded but mind alert, would shake his head. Not enough. And so she played again, trusting his ear, his instincts, the way he never missed the smallest details. He wasn't just there to listen, he was there to understand, to feel every note the way she did. He was there for the late-night mistakes, the wrong chords, the second guesses, and even in those moments when she doubted herself the most, he never wavered. "Try it again," he'd say, voice gentle, unwavering, and she would, over and over until doubt had no place left to hide. He watched her work with quiet admiration. He saw the fire in her, the way she lost herself in the music, as if nothing else in the world existed. "Play that last part again," he'd say, leaning in, his voice barely above a whisper. Ndwele would roll her eyes but oblige, her fingers gliding over the keys once more. And every time she did, he listened, really listened. As if her music was not just something to be heard, but something to be felt, something to be absorbed into his skin, his breath, his very being. She didn't say it, but she loved that about him. The way he made her believe, the way he treated her talent like something sacred. In a world that often demanded proof before offering validation, he gave her something rare, trust. He believed in her music as much as she did, maybe more. One night, long after the city had settled into its midnight hush, they sat side by side, the weight of the night pressing gently around them. Zuberi sat back, his fingers tapping absently against the wooden table, nodding along. He didn't rush her. He never did. He let the moment unfold, let the music breathe, let her find the sound she was searching for. Then, in the stillness, he finally spoke. "Why haven't you put this out into the world?" The The question lingered, heavier than the silence that followed. Ndwele's fingers stilled over the keys, her shoulders tensing ever so slightly. She exhaled slowly, because the world doesn't listen to women like me. The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. She didn't need to elaborate. Zuberi understood immediately, but he also knew something else. He knew that Nuelle was extraordinary, that her music wasn't just good, it was necessary, and the world needed to hear her. He turned to her, his voice steady, unwavering. "Then I'll make them listen." She let out a small chuckle, shaking her head as if dismissing his words as a foolish promise. But when she met his gaze, she saw the certainty there. The fierce determination, the kind that did not bend or break. It was the same look he had when sketching out a new architectural design, when building something that had never existed before. Only this time, she was the foundation he wanted to build upon. And for the first time, a small part of her dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. What she didn't know then was that this promise, the very one spoken in the warmth of the studio, in the presence of music and midnight, would one day shatter her heart. Zuberi wanted the world to hear her, to see what he saw in her, the brilliance, the fire, the undeniable gift she carried in her voice. A choice that would change everything. The office was nothing like the studio where their dreams had first taken flight. It smelled of polished leather and cold ambition, the air thick with expensive cologne and the weight of promises that had been made and broken before. Zuberi sat stiffly in his chair, surrounded by men in sleek suits, their words smooth as honey, their smiles sharper than the edges of their finely pressed collars. They spoke in riddles, wrapping opportunity in half-truths, making risk sound like destiny. "This is how it's done," they told him. "This is how the greats are made." They asked for the demo. He hesitated, just for a moment, his fingers tightening around the small USB drive that held more than just music. It held Ndwele's soul, her dreams, the hours of sleepless nights they had spent perfecting every note, every harmony. But then he thought of her, of the future she deserved. He thought of the world that had ignored voices like hers for too long. Maybe this was the way to make them listen. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he slid the USB across the polished wooden table. The weight of it was immeasurable, though it was barely the size of his thumb. "She'll get full credit, right?" Zuberi asked, his voice careful, hopeful. The executive leaned back in his chair, smiling like a man who had made this promise 1,000 times before. "Of course, she'll get what she deserves." The words should have reassured him. They didn't. But still, he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. And so, he walked out of that office, believing that this was a shortcut, not a mistake. That soon, she would be standing on stages she never thought possible, singing to crowds she never imagined. That she would look at him and say, "You did it. You made them listen." But then, days later, the world tilted sideways. The silence between them was louder than any song they had ever played together. Ndwele sat at her piano, her back straight, her hands resting on the keys. But she did not play. Her fingers hovered, motionless, over the ivory, as if music itself had betrayed her. The song, the one she had poured her soul into, the one that had been stolen, played softly from a speaker in the dimly lit apartment. It filled the room like a ghost, haunting the space between them, lingering in the air like an unspoken question. Zuberi stood in the doorway, frozen, watching her. He had run through the explanations, the justifications, the excuses. He had prepared words that might have once carried meaning. But now, standing here, seeing the way she sat so still, so silent, he realized none of it mattered. There was nothing he could say that would erase what he had done. What could he possibly offer that would make up for breaking the one thing that had always been sacred between them? His breath felt shallow, his hands empty. He had thought that if he could just stand in front of her, if he could just look her in the eyes, she would understand, that she would see the intention behind it all, that she would know he had done this for her. But the weight of his betrayal hung between them like an unspoken melody, one she had no desire to ever play again. He took a step forward, hesitant, his voice caught somewhere in his throat. He wanted to explain, to beg, to undo what had been done. Instead, only 2 words escaped. "I did it for you." The sound barely reached her over the song playing from the speakers, but she heard it. She let the words settle, let them echo in the space between them, and still she did not turn to face him. Her fingers curled slightly over the piano keys, pressing down just enough to let a single note ring out. It was deep, hollow, almost mournful, a sound that held the weight of all that had been lost. And then finally she turned. The silence between them was louder than any song they had ever played together. Ndwele sat at her piano, her back straight, her hands resting on the keys. But she did not play. Her fingers hovered, motionless, over the ivory, as if music itself had betrayed her. The song, the one she had poured her soul into, the one that had been stolen, played softly from a speaker in the dimly lit apartment. It filled the room like a ghost, haunting the space between them, lingering in the air like an unspoken question. Zuberi stood in the doorway, frozen, watching her. He had run through the explanations, the justifications, the excuses. He had prepared words that might have once carried meaning. But now, standing here, seeing the way she sat so still, so silent, he realized none of it mattered. There was nothing he could say that would erase what he had done. What could he possibly offer that would make up for breaking the one thing that had always been sacred between them? His breath felt shallow, his hands empty. He had thought that if he could just stand in front of her, if he could just look her in the eyes, she would understand, that she would see the intention behind it all, that she would know he had done this for her. But the weight of his betrayal hung between them like an unspoken melody, one she had no desire to ever play again. He took a step forward, hesitant, his voice caught somewhere in his throat. He wanted to explain, to beg, to undo what had been done. Instead, only two words escaped: "I did it for you." The sound barely reached her over the song playing from the speakers, but she heard it. She let the words settle, let them echo in the space between them, and still she did not turn to face him. Her fingers curled slightly over the piano keys, pressing down just enough to let a single note ring out. It was deep, hollow, almost mournful, a sound that held the weight of all that had been lost. And then finally she turned. The world had promised him a deal, a way to launch her name, to make her music heard, to turn her into the star she was destined to be. That was the dream they sold him, the illusion he had bought into. But dreams, when built on deception, shatter easily. They had taken everything. The moment he shook hands with men whose promises felt too easy, too rehearsed? Or was it the moment he slid the USB across the table, trusting that the industry's rules were the only way forward? "This is how the industry works," they had said. "Trust us, kid. You want her to win, don't you?" But the industry had swallowed him whole, and now he was drowning in the consequences. Ndwele was gone. Not physically. He knew she was still in the city, somewhere in the places they had once wandered together. Her presence lingering in the cafes where she used to hum softly under her breath, in the quiet bookstores where she'd run her fingers over the spines of poetry collections. But she was unreachable, lost behind the walls she had built to keep him out. She didn't answer his calls. She didn't open the door. Silence had become her only response. And so he did what any man who has lost everything does. He fought. He tried, in the only way he knew how. The first time, it was flowers at her doorstep, bright red hibiscus, their petals bold and open, much like the love they had once shared. He placed them gently, arranging them carefully, hoping she would see them, hoping she would understand, hoping they would say what words could not. The next day, the flowers were gone. Undeterred, he wrote, long, aching words spilling across pages, his apologies tangled with explanations, his regrets wrapped in the desperate hope that she would read them. He slid them under her door, tucked them between the pages of books he knew she loved, hoping that somewhere between the ink and the paper, she would find the part of him that still belonged to her. But if she read them, she gave no sign. Still, he did not stop. Regret is a heavy thing. It settles in the bones, makes a home in the hollow spaces left behind by loss. And Zuberi carried it with him every day, feeling its weight pressing against his ribs, reminding him of what he had done. One night, when the streets were quiet and the moon hung low, he stood outside her window humming a melody they had once composed together. It was soft, almost a whisper, carrying on the night breeze. A part of him hoped she was listening, that the notes would reach her the way words never could. The song had been theirs, created in the quiet hours of the night, woven from laughter and longing, a piece of both of them. He hummed it now, letting it drift toward her like an unspoken plea. But the window remained closed. He stayed for a while, leaning against the cool brick of the building, looking up at the dim glow behind her curtains. He thought he saw a shadow move, thought for a second that she might step forward, that she might open the window, that she might... But she didn't. She never did. Regret settled deeper in his chest, heavier than he could bear. The weight of knowing he had hurt the one person he had sworn to protect. The sting of realizing that his choices, no matter how well-intentioned, had broken something that might never be whole again. Days passed, then weeks. He stopped leaving flowers, stopped writing letters, stopped humming melodies into the night, because sometimes silence is not an absence, it is an answer. And yet, even in the quiet, one truth remained: love, when real, does not die so easily. Ndwele sought the only voice that never deceived: prayer. She had spent days trying to outrun the pain, filling the hours with distractions that did nothing to dull the ache in her chest. She walked through the streets she once shared with Zuberi, but the city felt different now, emptier, heavier. The places that once held joy were now reminders of all that had been lost. Every cafe, every quiet bookstore, every corner where they had stopped to listen to street musicians was tainted with memory. No matter where she went, the grief followed, a shadow stretching behind her. So she turned to the only place where silence was not absence, but solace. The church stood at the edge of the city, its ancient doors weathered by time, its walls filled with the quiet whispers of those who had come before her. She approached slowly, the weight in her chest made each step feel heavier. The world outside hummed with life, car horns, but inside these walls, there was only stillness. The kind of stillness that welcomed the brokenhearted. She walked inside, her footsteps light against the cool stone floor, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and burning wax. The dim glow of candlelight flickered across the high ceilings, casting golden shadows against the stained glass windows. A hush wrapped around her, not in cold indifference, but in quiet invitation. She moved past the rows of empty pews, the silence embracing her like an old friend. This was not the silence of Zuberi's betrayal, not the emptiness of unanswered calls or unreturned letters. This was a different kind of quiet, one that held space for healing. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Show me the way." Her eyes fluttered shut. She had always believed in forgiveness and second chances. But what did forgiveness mean when trust had been shattered? Could love survive after being broken? Could music ever sound the same when the melody had been stolen? She waited, searching, hoping for an answer. She heard nothing, not at first, only the faint crackle of burning wax, the distant murmur of the city outside, muffled by stone walls. The silence stretched on, not empty, but expectant, as if waiting for her to let go of the questions, to stop searching so desperately for an answer and simply be. And then something shifted. A gentle hand rested on her shoulder, pulling her from the depths of her thoughts. The touch was familiar, comforting. She opened her eyes and turned her head to see her mother standing beside her, wrapped in a rich Ankara shawl, her face lined with wisdom and love. "Child," her mother's voice was soft, steady, carrying years of knowing, of understanding. "Forgiveness is not for them. It is for you." Ndwele swallowed, her throat tight, her chest aching. She had spent so much time thinking about what Zuberi had done, about how he had hurt her, about how he had taken something precious and handed it to strangers. But now she realized she had been carrying that pain too tightly, letting it take up too much space inside her. Her mother had always taught her that forgiveness was not about excusing pain, but about releasing it, about refusing to let it harden her heart. She thought of the music she had written, the melodies that once came so freely, now trapped beneath the weight of betrayal. She thought of Zuberi, not just the man who had betrayed her, but the man who had once believed in her before she even believed in herself. Was he the sum of his worst mistake, or was he, like all people, a composition of both light and shadow? The answer did not come as a voice, nor as a grand revelation. It came as something quieter, a loosening of the grip around her heart, a shift in the weight she had been carrying, not disappearing, but softening just enough. Forgiveness would not be easy, It would not be instant, but perhaps it could begin here. Ndwele inhaled deeply, closing her eyes one last time. And so, she listened. And in the silence she found it, a song. Not a song of pain, not a song of loss, but of something greater, of redemption, of healing, of finding her voice again. Ndwele had spent weeks lost in the storm of emotions. Betrayal, anger, regret, sorrow. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting, like a song stuck in an unresolved chord. She had tried to forget, to move forward without looking back, but music had always been her way of making sense of the world. And now, after all that had been stolen, after all that had been broken, she had only one choice: to create again. So she sat before her piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. The hesitation was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, and let her hands press down. A hesitant note, then another. The melody was soft at first, fragile, but it grew stronger, as if it had been waiting to be set free, waiting to remind her that she had never truly lost her gift, that no one could ever take it from her. The more she played, the more the weight in her chest loosened, turning into something else. It was no longer grief, it was transformation. She picked up her pen, her fingers trembling slightly, but she did not stop. Note by note, lyric by lyric, she rewrote her story. She didn't write about betrayal. She didn't write about loss. She wrote about what came after, about the choice to rise, to create, to forgive. Not just Zuberi, but herself, about learning that scars do not mean something is broken. They mean something has survived. The song took shape, flowing from her in waves, carrying with it everything she had held inside. The pain, the lessons, the love that had not died but had instead changed, reshaped itself into something stronger. And when she sang it for the first time, the world stopped. The same world that had stolen from her now wept at her feet. The song was raw, it was powerful, it was undeniable. It spread like wildfire, from small underground clubs to the biggest venues on the continent. It climbed the charts, played on radios, was shared in whispers and in loud, joyous declarations. It became more than a song. It became a movement, a declaration that no one could silence a voice meant to be heard. Her name was no longer a footnote. It was the headline, the moment, the music. And Zuberi, he stood in the crowd that night, his breath caught in his throat. He had heard her voice 1,000 times before, had watched her weave magic from melodies, had believed in her before anyone else had. But now she was something else entirely. A force, a light, a truth that could no longer be hidden. For the first time, he did not try to explain himself. He did not try to fix what had been broken. He simply listened, knowing that this moment belonged to her. And the world listened too. And when the biggest label in Africa finally came calling, when the contract, the kind that once seemed impossible, was placed on the table, it was not an executive who handed it to her. It was Zuberi. This time, it was truly hers. The night before her first tour, she packed her bags, her heart steady, her spirit at peace. She zipped up the suitcase, straightened, and turned. In the doorway, he stood watching, waiting, a quiet question in his eyes. She met his gaze, the echoes of their past lingering between them. But there was no anger now, no resentment. Only something softer, something that had survived the fire and emerged stronger. She smiled, her voice gentle, unwavering. "Come with me." He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't doubt. He simply nodded. And so they walked forward together. Sometimes love must be broken to be rebuilt stronger. And now their journey had only just begun.
Stop me, oh, I see the matter. You tell me, said a mistake. The thunder will strike, I'm don't go. The matter. You tell me, said a mistake. The thunder will strike, I'm don't go. I see the matter. Betrayal, oh. go day alright. Ooh, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ooh, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ah, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ah, I see the matter. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. I see the matter. The thunder will strike, don't go. I see the matter. I see the matter. The thunder will strike, don't go. I see the matter. I see the matter. The thunder will strike, don't go. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. Yeah, I no go blame you. Them no fit stop me, oh. I see the matter. They tell me say na mistake. The thunder will strike, don't go. The matter. They tell me say na mistake. The thunder will strike, don't go. I see the matter. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. You go day alright, and I go day alright. Ooh, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ooh, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ah, ah. I see the matter. I go day alright, and you go day alright. Ah, I see the matter. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. Betrayal, oh, unforgiveness, oh, your heart dead there, my love. The story there inside. I see the matter. The thunder will strike, don't go. I see the matter. I see the matter. The thunder will strike, don't go. I see